Welcome back to Theology Curator. My name's Kurt Willems, and I'm excited to jump into this episode with you. We are in a series called Jesus Politics, and we're looking at the book of Revelation, so it has to be fun, right? Before we get into that, though, I wanted to let you know about a wonderful opportunity coming up in November. November 18th through the 25th, there is an online interdisciplinary conference on Christology, the study of Christ. I mean, pretty cool stuff. It's called Christ Among the Disciplines, and it's going to feature 70 world-leading scholars in biblical theology, philosophy, and biblical studies. So I think you are going to have a real treat if you join in. There's going to be presentations, 16 different book panels, and a lot of various other discussions on this topic, which I think is going to be really cool. We have some former guests to the show. Of course, N.T. Wright will be a part of it. J.R. Daniel Kirk and Lucy Pepiot are just a couple of people that are going to be a part of it, along with various other scholars that I definitely would love to hear from. I've got people like Thomas J. Ord that I'm seeing on this great list. I'm seeing Ben Witherington III on here. I'm seeing Chris Tilling. I'm seeing there's so many, honestly. Like, it's pretty overwhelming, actually, with all of the good scholars that are going to be a part of this thing. So if going deep on biblical studies, theology, and philosophy regarding Christology sounds awesome to you, which it should, here's the deal. Go to ChristAmongTheDisciplines.com. That's ChristAmongTheDisciplines.com and register. It's coming quick, so hopefully you can get your ticket and set aside the time to watch this live event.
Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
Welcome back, my friends. Today, we are jumping back into Jesus Politics. My name's Kurt Willems. I'm your host here, and I am excited because we are actually in a sort of like a micro series within the big series, Jesus Politics. We're in this little section where we're looking at the book of Revelation and end times themes, kind of at an upper level sort of look. I'm going to give some big picture ideas about Revelation and try and connect some dots so that when these issues come up in political conversation, you at least have a foundation to stand on, and then you can use resources to kind of move from there. So in the future, I plan to actually do a long series on Revelation, and maybe we'll get some more details out of that. Right now, I want to remind us that in the book of Revelation, what we have is something called apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is something that is very important because it is the key to understanding how to read this book. It is an image-saturated sort of genre, and it is something that invites us to engage and be sort of creative and imaginative. These images aren't always literally what we think when we read them off the page, but there is a deeper sort of meaning and intention that the author of Revelation often has in mind. So right now what I want to do is introduce our topic, Revelation and resistance. Revelation and resistance. Because apocalyptic literature, one of its key functions is to serve as a poetic counterstory to whatever evil empire is oppressing God's people. There's lots of examples of this in Jewish literature, but not so much in the Christian scriptures. We have the book of Revelation, and we have a few moments that utilize apocalyptic language. Jesus utilizes apocalyptic language in places like Mark 13 in the parallels. We call that the Olivet Discourse. And this is language that is cryptically loaded, pointing towards a political reality. That's really significant. We also have some of this in Paul's letters and in other places in the New Testament. And then, of course, in Revelation, we have the clearest, obvious version of apocalyptic literature. Let's talk really quick about what Revelation is and what it's doing. And Revelation, this last book of the Bible, it is a revelation of Jesus. So the book of Revelation is all about revealing Jesus to the readers. It's a revelation of Jesus to John for the church against the empire during the first century. That is so important to understand, that we root this book as a resistance document against the ideology of Roman imperialism. That, my friends, should already get us thinking about the way we would invite Revelation to inform our political imagination in the 21st century. What was it doing in the first century? It was inviting people to see the way that evil was running rampant and was oppressing God's people, and then to say, we can be a radical alternative. And some of that's going to be done through various sorts of imagery, but at the end, it will be clear that a new creation is coming. And in fact, this new creation has already been born through the resurrection of Jesus. So let's really step in to the resistance part of Revelation, and we'll also try and draw out a few very important big picture themes, because I think it's really going to help us. So thinking about this, I want to start with a quotation from J. Nelson Craybrill. He has a book called Apocalypse and Allegiance, okay? Now, anything I'm quoting here, unless I tell you not to go get it, is something that you can track down and go deeper. And so this is one of those resources. I would say it's written at a moderate academic level. So if you have some background in this stuff, it's probably a great resource. But here we go. Nelson Craybrill says this. He says, Revelation highlights the way worship, with its reliance on symbol expresses and shapes allegiance. The last book of the Bible is not a catalog of predictions about events that would take place 2,000 years later. Rather, it is a projector that casts archetypal images of good and evil onto a cosmic screen. These images, first of all, speak to realities of the author's era. But Revelation also serves as a primer on how good and evil interact in every generation. That's the end of the quote, my friends, and that is a good quote. So, if that's the case, if Revelation isn't so much about predicting a bunch of events thousands of years later, like in our time, but really is speaking to the first century in its own way about allegiance and then kind of extending those things into any space where good and evil are at cosmic level battle in the midst of empire and all of that stuff, then, we can really learn a lot from it. Michael Gorman, another person I'm going to continue to point to, probably the most foundational and helpful book I ever read on Revelation was Gorman's Reading Revelation Responsibly. So I really draw a lot of my ideas from that one book. If I were to say, go get one book, it would be that one. I would second that with N.T. Wright's Revelation for Everyone if you want something that looks at passages individually in a devotional but academically informed format. I think that's a great resource. I think Nelson Crabill's book is a great resource. There's a few others I'll mention along the way. But Michael Gorman says this, that Revelation has some very specific aims, and I want to walk through three of those aims. First of all, Revelation is Theo Poetic. Theo Poetic. What does that mean? Well, Theo Poetic is a way of really talking about worship. Revelation is a book about worship. It's saying things Theo about God in poetic sorts of ways. And here's how I might summarize that Revelation is similar to a counter liturgy, one that reminds Christians both then and now that the civil religion of empire must never capture our imaginations. There is so much language embedded in our culture, things like God bless America, for instance. And we are always good when we think that God could bless us. But we also, in the same breath, should hope that God blesses all the nations. And then we should question what we mean by blessing. I mean, there's a lot there. But in our own sort of understanding, there is often this mixture of political ideas about the United States and God's blessing. Well, it's really interesting considering what the New Testament continuously does is push us to see the way of Jesus as counter, the way of Jesus as the alternative, the way of Jesus as something better than any empire. And so Revelation's trying to invite us into the contrast. There is a God who was revealed by Jesus as a slaughtered lamb who is in fact the Savior and Lord of the entire cosmos. Revelation wants us to see that God on full display. I want to also go to another point. The second one here from Gorman is Revelation is also a theopolitical text. Theopolitical text. So it is a God's politics kind of text. And maybe we would say, just as it is a book about worship, it is a book that is uncivil in character. It is going to confront in various ways the idolatry, both in its nationalistic forms and also in its just straight up worship of false gods forms. This is what Revelation does. It says, look, the system that has been built to prop up the Roman Empire that looks like beautiful, wonderful sorts of things. Caesar saved us from the political unrest and all the messages that people would be hearing. Revelation comes in and says, that's a bunch of garbage. That's a lie. Don't listen to that. And we'll talk more about how that happens. So in one sense, Revelation is theopolitical. It's about God's politics confronting the civil religions of the day. We have civil religion, as I keep saying. I mean, every time we put our hand on our heart and say the Pledge of Allegiance, what are we doing? We're stepping into a civil script that tells us a certain thing about the way the world is arranged. Well, Revelation wants to disrupt those scripts and say, no. This book is going to be uncivil. It's going to disrupt those narratives and invite you to see what is really real. And what's really real is that the only allegiance worthy of your time is a slaughtered lamb who refused to fight enemies. Yeah, refused to fight enemies and allowed the enemies to do their worst. And yet, how did this Jesus, this slaughtered lamb, conquer? Through resurrection, by upstaging, not by fighting. Super important. So we have a book that's about worship. We have a book that's uncivil. And then we have this last theme that we want to make sure we understand. Revelation carries with it a pastoral, prophetic tone. Pastoral, prophetic tone. The writer is doing something very specific, saying, hey, 7 churches in the region of Asia Minor, here is what I see in you. Here is what you're doing well to resist the idolatry of the Roman Empire and the ways that it oppresses people. And here's where you're missing the mark. And so it's pastoral, but also prophetic. It's prophetic, not about just future things, which really there's not a ton of future things as we've often thought about future things when it comes to prophecy in Revelation, but prophetic in that it speaks to the time. And it speaks to all times in a sense. So it is giving the voice of God towards people. It is a witness book. It is trying to help us see that there is something better than what the kingdoms of this world might offer us. Revelation is worship, Revelation is uncivil, and Revelation is a witness to the way of Jesus and invites us to be witnesses of this Jesus. So, what do we do with this? I mean, it's really important that we break some of this down. And what I want to do is I want to talk about a few elements that are, I think, pretty popular in how people read Revelation. So the first thing is I want to look at a passage in Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 4. I want to give this as an example of how the book of Revelation is an apocalyptic resistance piece of literature and not merely trying to give us a moment-by-moment preview of how the future is going to unfold. That in fact, it was a resistance letter in the first century towards a first century reality. Here's what this passage has to say. Again, we are going very quick through Revelation, and we're going to go way deeper in another series in the future. But here's where we'll start. We'll start I'm going to start in verse 18 of chapter 12 that kind of blends into chapter 13 for the first 4 verses. Here we go. Then the dragon stood on the seashore, and I saw a beast coming up out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads. Each of its horns was decorated with a royal crown, and on its heads were blasphemous names. The beast I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. The dragon gave it his power, throne, and great authority. I want to stop here because I want to make sure that you're just tracking for a moment. The dragon, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but the dragon is Satan, right? The dragon is the Satan. And it's important that you know this. And notice how Revelation says it. The dragon gave it its power, throne, and great authority. What does that sound like? Well, it sounds like Jesus in the desert, doesn't it? It sounds like the temptation Jesus faced when the devil in the desert said, look, I have all of the authority of these kingdoms and I can give it to whoever I want. Do you want it? And Jesus, of course, resists that, but never denies the claim that the Satan has some sort of dominion and influence in all of the kingdoms of the world. Well, we see that clearly right here. Okay, let's keep going. So the dragon gave it his power, throne, and great authority. One of its heads, okay, so of the beast that we're talking about, one of its heads appeared to have been slain and killed, but its deadly wound was healed. By the way, I'll pause there. This is an empire image from the first century. I can't go deep into it, but a lot of scholars think that this has to do with a previous emperor before the emperor that would be during John's time. John is dealing with an emperor called Domitian in the 90s of the first century, but Domitian in a lot of ways really seemed like the re-embodiment of another oppressive emperor named Nero. And so some scholars, and I tend to agree with them, would connect this phrase that there is one that had been slain. It seemed to have been slain, but was actually healed. There's a whole myth about Nero being revived, and that seems to be where this is coming from. I can't go deep here, but maybe that's just a nugget, something to go sort of track down a little bit on the Google machine, okay? So, continuing on. So the whole earth was amazed and followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon because it had given the beast its authority. They worshipped the beast and said, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" Okay, friends. Now, we need to really talk about these beasts. We're going to see that in Revelation, there is a beast from the sea and a beast from the earth. And understanding who these beasts are and what it's really talking about is going to be really beneficial. Because I have grown up in a situation where I heard many things about the beast. The beast is the Antichrist that is coming, and we need to be aware. And, people have alluded to it being Bill Gates, of all people. It's so funny to me. But for years, people have talked about different beasts, different antichrists that have come, whether it's the Pope or a president you don't like, a foreign leader you don't like. It always comes to this, that people are like, maybe that's the one. Maybe that's the Antichrist. Well, friends, I want to break down why that's just not helpful and how those kinds of impulses really mess up our political posture in the world. Here's what we need to know. First of all, the dragon. I already kind of said who the dragon is, but the dragon is identified in chapter 12 and chapter 20 as, quote, the old snake who is called the devil and Satan, end quote. So this is the power behind the throne of the Roman imperial machine. This Roman imperial machine that is set out to conquer the whole world with the sword of what they called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. How do you have peace for Rome? You conquer everyone else and don't let them fight you. That's how you have peace for Rome. And so the dragon is identified as the power source behind the Roman Empire. Again, this shouldn't surprise us. In the Gospels, we have this same thing happening in Luke. We have heard in Luke in the first couple of chapters, first few chapters, that twice the Roman Empire in some way, shape, or form is identified as the leader and the power of the whole world. But then you get to Luke chapter 4, Jesus is in the desert, and who's actually in charge? Oh, it's the devil who has the power and authority. Yeah, so this is so consistent with the imagery of the Gospels. And you then get to, of course, the beast. And there is a sea beast, and I don't have time to break down all of the imagery, but scholars in the camp of really trying to read this as apocalyptic resistance literature, like all of the other apocalypses we have, rather than being all about some future cataclysmic event with 7-year tribulation and Antichrist and all that kind of stuff. Most academic scholars of literature like this are now saying, no, you know what? The sea beast really is the military and political power of Roman emperors. That's what's going on here. And I totally agree with this. And it makes perfect sense because, again, it's talking about a kingdom in the world that everyone is so pumped on, right? People are constantly in the first century saying, who is like Rome? Who is like the Roman emperors? Who is like, the original, right? Caesar Augustus. The poetry, the imagery, whether or not we believe it as first century people, the propaganda is everywhere. And this book, this Christian book says, do not listen to political propaganda. It's a bunch of malarkey. And this sea beast, who, by the way, if you know what I'm saying, nudge, nudge, is the military and political power of Roman emperors. And we're going to see that theme played out. And then, of course, there is an earth beast who, and I'm going to quote a scholar named Richard Bauckham, who, in my opinion, has done the most helpful work on Revelation. And he has a couple of academic books that you can track down on the book of Revelation. And the earth beast, quote, promotes the imperial cult by setting up the image of the beast and giving it godlike characteristics. So what's that about? So it's, you've heard about like the false prophet maybe of the Antichrist and the Antichrist false prophet. Well, translate that into first century for a minute. And the false prophet really is actually a whole system of religious devotion that's tied to things like economic flourishing. You want to make a business deal, you have to do these various cultic actions within the context of a meal often. There are many different ways that this imperial cult, a cult that gives worship to the Roman emperors, a cult that gives worship to the goddess Roma, the cult that gives worship to the god of peace, Pax, the cult that gives worship to all of these deities that Rome really wants people to embrace so that they can continue to run the world. That's what the earth beast is all about. The earth beast isn't a single person. The earth beast is a system of glorification of the Roman Empire. And that, my friends, should make us uncomfortable anytime we now look at our world and we see our own sort of situation where people translate the United States as though it is in fact holy and godlike and maybe even Christian. That, my friends, is not consistent with what Jesus obviously is trying to get us to see here. The way of Jesus is always better. And the way of Jesus discerns where the dragon is influencing, where the beasts, whatever they are, the Roman Empire, and by extension, any empire, and of course, where the earth beast, the things that prop up that system. We are so great. We are so awesome. We have done all of these great things. Look at our history. Look at our progress. Look at all this stuff. And while silencing the reality, both in Rome and in the United States, that beneath the facade of this glorious, beautiful origin story about how these nations came to be, how they'd been blessed by the divine to create power structures, because underneath all of that are all of the people that don't have voice, those people at the margins of the story. And here's the thing. We need to listen to those stories and not be deceived by the prophets of civil religion, both in the first century and today. Because once you give these things divine credibility, everything they do, for the most part, especially if it's consistent with your particular political vision, everything they do within that vision then becomes cause for celebration and worship. This is why we've seen so many conservative Christians come around a president like Trump. And I'm not going to go deep into why I'm not a big fan of Trump. I haven't hidden that fact. But I simply would say that anytime we're starting to over praise presidents as though God has given them to us by some divine decree, we are in danger of violating the very impulse that Revelation is inviting us to step into. The very storyline that Revelation tells is in contrast to anyone and anything that we would promote as divine and holy because it politically matches what we want for the world. That all comes from the devil. That all comes from the dragon. And sometimes we can't quite see it. And so I leave us with this question. How might Jesus be inviting us to resist the demonic forces that influence our empire, our country, our states, our cities, just like John seems to be inviting first century Jesus followers to resist? We'll come back to some of these themes in the next episode. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.